did the computation group, and with all their new machines, did you have your own building on the Livermore campus, or well, how did that work?
I suspect computation, of course I can't remember exactly, but I suspect computation I suspect our building was entirely computation.
Okay.
And the other buildings were, yeah. I didn't run into the nuclear folks very often.
Teller wasn't around your offices a lot.
Right.
Was he, you were there in the first half of the 60s, basically?
I stayed there from like 62 to 66.
Okay.
And then at 66, I went over to Tymshare.
Right. Was Teller the director of the laboratory then? Okay. Did he cast a long shadow of the laboratory? He's such a kind of interesting, big historical figure.
Fascinating guy, but of course I'm on the bottom.
Right.
I mean, he didn't know me from anybody. So, but yeah, he's a fascinating guy, and yes, we all knew he was the guy on top, and we were all fascinated by his work. But that didn't affect me personally.
Right. I just wondered what his kind of presence was in the laboratory, as you know.
I think he had a lot more presence out in the rest of the lab.
Yeah.
Computation Sid really ran computation totally.
Right.
We were interested in what the rest of the lab was doing, and of course interested in very respectful of Teller and fascinated by his work, but well aware of the contribution he'd made to the work we were doing.
Right.
But didn't have any day-to-day impact on computation, which Sid had a lot of day-to-day.
How did you feel personally about the nuclear weapons, raison d'etre of Livermore? Did that, was it, I just wondered how you felt about that.
I don't know how much I actually thought about it.
Mm-hmm.
I wish there weren't nuclear weapons, but this was the 60s, and Cold War. But it was hard to know what was the right thing to do.
Yeah.
Other than having nuclear weapons, and there was no way to know enough to know whether or not that was the right thing to do, and that.
It was the dealt hand, if you will.
Yeah.
To go back to.
Yeah. It wasn't. Yeah.
It also seems that a lot of the work that you did at Livermore was making compilers.
Yeah.
And I wondered about, what.
And the editor. Yeah.
And the editor. But about making compilers in particular, I was wondering about compiler making as a kind of programming versus application programming, or making these models and simulations like the other people were doing. Is there something distinctive about building compilers, and if so, what is it?
Well, doing system programming versus application programming is very different.
Better division.
It's very, very different, right?
Could you speak to those differences?
Well, you have to have a very different background, because to do application programming, you've got to know what your application. You have to be, if what you're going to do is decide how much of an explosion you're going to have with this size nuclear weapon, you really got to understand the physics in a lot of depth, a lot more depth than a system programmer ever has to do.
Right.
System programming, though, has other interesting challenges. How do you write these compilers for all the different kinds of people and questions, and what do you optimize? How much time do you spend on that? And because you have a lot of choices. What choices do you make? And so it's a whole different world. And I don't know, just different background completely, and different way of looking at things. If you're writing one of these explosion analysis programs, you're the one who's going to write it, you're going to run it, and you're going to read the results. It's all your story. Right. You write a compiler, and everybody else in the lab is going to use it. And so you have to look at the whole thing as serving a whole lot of people, none of whom you'll ever meet, and making them think that this works well for them. It's a different way of looking at what you're doing.
The general needs of the user community, and then you must have to have such a strong knowledge of the computer, the hardware.
The hardware.
Yeah.
You have to know the hardware. And you mentioned all those different compilers, because I probably mentioned them.
Yes.
One of the things that was fun about writing so many different compilers is we got to write, I can't remember what they were for, but a few apps for at that time. And one of the things that I learned really the hard way was that if you have to choose the right language for your app. That I could write something in, what it would take to write something in one of these languages, you could write it in a few lines, and you could choose another language, and it's several pages. It's just huge difference if you choose the right language, depending on the app. And it depends totally on the app. So I would get, Lisp, I wrote this program in Lisp, and it's only 5 lines, and it would have taken me 3 days to write it in Fortran, so I'll start writing my programs in Lisp. No, it only worked for that application. Oh. All the rest of them were 3 lines in Fortran and pages in Lisp. So really choosing your language is really important, and it's made it clear to me why there are so many languages today. As you get different apps and use your computer in so many different ways, you have different languages because one is so much more efficient than another for the different apps.
And how do you, if you're working on a variety of apps, how do you know which one to, it doesn't seem like it's obvious which one to choose ahead of time.
Well, it becomes obvious pretty fast, as it turns out.
Once you begin.
Once you begin. And once you've done a few, you pretty much know where to go for the app you're working on.
Experience.
Mm-hmm.
But it's a kind of empirical.
I suspect that if you did that for several years, you would have better rules. you would figure it out. But for me, it was just. I'm not going to complain again about all these languages I have to write compilers for. I now understand why I'm writing compilers for so many different languages.
I see.
And at Tymshare, they had all these different compilers, and they kept wanting to, and people would complain, why we already have Super Basic, why do we need Fortran? And I would say, no. Different languages work for different programs.
And the customers are going to have the widest possible assortment of applications. So
that's right.
Was it at Livermore that you met Norman Hardy?
No, he was on the Stretch. He came from Livermore to Stretch on loan to IBM to make sure that Stretch was designed in a way that would be useful to Livermore.
Oh, so you'd met him back
east.
back east.
Yeah.
Okay.
So I'd already known him when I came out here.
And was it you and he married when you were working at Livermore? Is that?
While I was going to school.
Okay. And were you in the same group at Livermore?
He was in computation mostly. Norm's expertise is wandering all over the place and finding and listening to people's problems and showing them how to solve those problems with half a dozen lines of code instead of 10 pages. That's just what he does. He figures out how to look at a problem from a completely different perspective than everybody else in the room and make it simple. And so he would work on all the different kinds of programs that they had in Livermore, the science programs, the system programs, everywhere, because that's what he's really good at.
What was his background coming into it? Was he coming from mathematics or?
Math.
Okay.
Physics. I think he was a physics major, actually.
And were you living near to Livermore? Were you still living in Berkeley and commuting?
No,
there?
I lived in Livermore. I moved to Livermore.
Okay.
Once I was through with Berkeley, I moved to Livermore.
Okay. And okay, we talked to and that time-sharing system that was developed at Livermore was called Octopus. Is that correct?
That's what we called it. I think it had a more formal name, but I
that
don't
was
know
your
what that
name.
is. Norm knows, and if you ever do an interview with Norm, which would be fascinating, because he remembers everything. He's stayed involved. You know, he still works with companies, startup companies, on designing, on hardware design, software design. So he's stayed involved much more than I have, and so he remembers much more. And whatever the official name is, I think Norm remembers that, but I don't.
Okay. Octopus was the one I think maybe that I cribbed from your notes.
That's what we called it, but I think it got a better name sometime.
Well, I was curious in terms of systems programming, a time-sharing operating system. I was just wondering what the kind of the crux was of a time-sharing operating system versus other sorts of system software. What was distinctive about it to allow, this multiple user operation? Was there a crux, or were there many? I'm just curious.
Well, I can give you a lot more detail about the one I wrote than the one at Livermore, and I wrote the one at Tymshare.
Right, which was what you did almost immediately. That was your next project when you left.
I left Livermore. Norm had gotten a job offer from IBM over here in Menlo Park, and fortunately, Tymshare had a little blurb in Datamation about how they were going to start a time-sharing company, and so as I say, once you've used time-sharing, you're addicted. You never want to go back to carry card decks again. So I called them up and came over and talked to them. I called them up and asked them if I could have a teletype at home. I mean, they were advertising that they were going to put teletypes in your office so you could connect to their big computer. So I said, I want one in my house. And that is not something they had ever thought of. So, but we had a nice, Dave Schmidt is very friendly. He was the VP at Tymshare, and I talked to him. And he was in charge of all the technology at Tymshare at the time. And So I talked to him for quite a long time, and about what they were going to do, and he told me all their plans and stuff. So I went home and called him up the next week and said, what you need to do is hire me to write your operating system, which they called the monitor, because you don't have anybody who knows anything about it. And so I went back and interviewed to do that, and they hired me because they didn't have any idea what the operating system was. He had worked at GE, and they had a very simple time-sharing system, but they delivered the operating system. That was the whole thing. And he had expected SDS when they delivered the machine, which they hadn't yet at that time. He expected SDS to deliver a working operating system. It hadn't really occurred to him that this wasn't going to be quite the way it worked out. So they hired me to write the operating system and kind of figure out what was going on. And so it was very casual to start out with, and until they figured out that the whole, if the operating system doesn't work, it doesn't matter how good your your shell is, it doesn't matter how good your spreadsheets are. If your operating system doesn't work, nothing works.
Huh. And did you have a suspicion that the SDS machine would not come with a proper time-sharing operating system? It couldn't. Why couldn't it have?
They were delivering it with peripherals. So, for starters, and this was the operating system that came from Berkeley originally. And they had modified the 930 to be a 940, and SDS then produced 940s pretty much on Berkeley's design, and Berkeley had done the operating system. But when Berkeley did the operating system, there were no peripherals, except for mag tape. So they did all the swapping to mag tape. You had to load all your information from mag tape. Now, if you've ever tried to have multiple users on a computer that swaps users to mag tape, you will notice that it is extremely slow.
This means it would store one user's state on a tape and then load in another user's state and work on it, and then constant, okay. And is this the Berkeley GENIE project, is that?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
And Berkeley did a great job. As if you ever interview Norm, I basically replaced every instruction in their operating system for one reason or another, just because everything was different when you're, I would be happy to go into details until you're bored to death. But the architecture, the basic architecture stayed Berkeley. All the instructions changed.
And this was to rewrite it for an environment where you wouldn't do any of this tape swapping
we wanted to run, the truth is, if you can run one user doing more than one job on a mag tape. If you try to get two users, it's 5 or 10 minutes is what it feels like between jobs.
Okay.
Because of all the reading and writing you have to do. And it's fascinating to watch the tapes, but it's but it's not very good for the user.
Right.
So we had to get disks to store. We got data products disks, big disks, to store the files for people, so that you could leave your files out there and come back the next day and they'd still be there. And then we got a Vermont drum to do the swapping. And there were some issues with with both of these peripherals. These were peripherals that were not programmed by Berkeley and therefore not programmed by SDS.
I see. So therefore you knew that
And-
they didn't have what they needed.
And if you've never been able to run more than 2 people on your operating systems, things like the queues are all screwed up because all the buffers are the wrong size, all kinds of things in the operating system are just totally out of line. They had no way of knowing what would happen if you put 30 users on instead of 2. 1 or 2, and they had no way of knowing. They did a good job. They left space, but it turned out not to be the right amount of space in almost any of these places where you had to keep track of the various users.
So if they didn't yet have their SDS, they being Tymshare when you called them, if they had not received their computer yet, were they just really in a kind of you were employee 5, was it,
Yeah.
or something? So it's a
Right.
very formative stage?
Very formative stage.
I mean,
Yes, very formative stage. I think they'd only been, I'm not sure they had, whether they'd become incorporated the month before or the month after, but it was like,
Okay.
it was that close.
Right at the start.
You're right at the start.
And, when they were talking to you about their idea for the firm, their aspirations, their basic, the basic point, how did they describe it to you? What was their vision?
Well, you know the backstory of why they started it at all.
I don't.
Tom and Dave had both worked for GE, and that's where they knew each other. And GE was, Tom had worked for GE for years, and they had transferred him around here and there. He was really a good sales manager, a really good sales manager. And so they liked to move him to where they needed really good sales manager. So they were about to move him to Phoenix, and his wife, Marge, said, "I've moved enough." And, so at which point Dave came along and said, "We could start a company here and do time sharing." And, and so they had planned to license the GE system and just sell it.
Right.
It got right down to the wire, and GE decided that they didn't want that competition. So that's when they found the SDS system, the 940 at Berkeley, the Berkeley system, and so Tom's, their original goal was just to provide time sharing for right then, this whole area was aerospace companies.
Right.
Their goal was to provide time sharing for the engineers in the aerospace companies so that they could all get on and do their testing and not have to wait 24 hours for the big machine. Because there's lots of these little algorithms that you can test out, make sure your code really works before you do the big machine.
Right.
And that was their vision. And the trouble was, they did that, and then they had all kinds of other people who wanted. Then they sold to a company up here, and then a branch in Los Angeles wanted the same service, and so that's basically what happened to Tymshare.
So that explains why there's this kind of Los Angeles looking dimension to the timeshare story, in just a few steps from where we are now.
Exactly.
Well, so let's see. I thought it was interesting too that I hadn't realized that what prompted you to call Timeshare Norm Hardy's move to this IBM
Yeah.
Advanced Computer System
Right.
effort which I guess was in Sunnyvale, or
It was in Menlo Park.
Oh, Menlo Park.
And Gene Amdahl was key in that project, probably the leader of that project.
and this was to be kind of the successor to Stretch.
Yeah, and it was, well, whether it turned out to be Stretch or some follow-on to Stretch, yeah, it was the next, big leap in computers. And Gene had done the 360, so.
Yeah.
Where do you go? What's the next supercomputer is more than what's the next standard line of computers.
Right. Just I hadn't realized that development was, in this area as well,
Yeah.
and that lasted for
Couple of years.
Yeah. Very interesting. Well, let's see. When you had kind of, you'd seen time sharing at Livermore, you knew time sharing at Livermore. When you spoke to Dave, was there this discussion of the computer, like computing as a utility? Was that, or was that something you had been following? Was that part of this context?
Well, what I wanted was access to the computer from my home. And since they wouldn't give it to me if I wasn't, they had never thought about giving anybody a computer at home, access at home, but it was pretty clear that if I went and worked for them and did the monitor, they would give me a computer. Eventually figure out that I could have a teletype at home. So that's what I did.
But there was this kind of discussion, I think, more broadly in computing circles in the computer industry about it as sort of like a metered utility that,
Absolutely.
So that was later, or?
Well, as I say, their goal was to service the local aerospace companies, and we charged $10 an hour once we got the machine up, and we can talk about what that meant, but that's what it was. It was just for people to do these testing of their little algorithms, and so we had various compilers. We got a super basic, which made it really easy. It was an interpreter, so it was really easy to run a little code and find out exactly if your code wasn't right, exactly where the bug was. You could fix it as it was stepping through. And so it was just very, very convenient for people in like the aerospace industry,
Right.
who needed lots of these little engineering programs. It was just perfect.
Well, let's talk then about coming to work for Tymshare, what your position was when you first started, and your effort to, I guess, your building of a time-sharing operating system. Did that coincide with the arrival of the computer, or how did it all work?
Well, there wasn't much you could do. I mean, I read the listings till I knew that, the listings that Berkeley had provided of the monitor. They called what we call the operating system, they called the monitor.
Okay.
Okay, so, and what we call the shell, they call the exec.
Mm-hmm.
So so as we switch back and forth in languages, you know what I'm talking about. And, so they provided a listing for the monitor, and so of course I was extremely familiar with that. The machine didn't arrive until probably September, and so there were I had lots of time to read the listing.
Where were you doing that? Were you at the
Distal Drive.
Okay.
They had an office, a very small office on Distal Drive, and that's where I did that. And when the machine came, the machine went into a machine room down on East Meadow, and then of course I worked down there. Tom and Dave and Rick Crandall from Tymshare had, I think, Rick had started Tymshare also with the intent of using SDS 940s. And I think they had negotiated with SDS to make this machine. Oh, here's 2 companies that are going to buy your machine if you'll just make one. Yeah, make a few, and as it turned out, there were more than just 2 companies that used it. But I think Rick Crandall and Tom and Dave made the original agreements with SDS to do this. So that summer, when SDS was within a month or 2 of actually delivering the machine, Rick and Louise, his wife, came out to do some testing because they made the machine at Berkeley available, but it was still swapping to tape, so that while you could get on and look at some things, it was very slow.
Mm-hmm.
Didn't really didn't really help very much. It was more useful to read the listings than it was to try to get on the machine.
Right.
And so they were here anyway. They were here for a couple months, and so we all got quite friendly. And at that point in time, Tymshare it never occurred to Tom or Dave that they would be any place except Silicon Valley, and it never occurred to Rick Crandall that he would be any place except he was back in Michigan, and so there was no conflict. And up until this time, I mean, you either had to be near a computer or you didn't get to use one. And
right.
So who would have thought it was going to be different in the future? And so that's what they went home before our machine was actually delivered. The machine came and probably came with a card reader, print, maybe paper type. But no disc, no drums. So I guess startup was paper tape, and then it would read in your cards from, that was the loader was on the paper type, and then you could read the cards. It would do something from there. But you couldn't, and we did store the monitor on mag tape, so I could read them, start up the machine, load in the monitor from the mag tape, and get it to run a little bit.
Right.
This came shortly thereafter. So I had to write the drivers.
Purchased separately.
Purchased separately. Disk for data products disks. And SDS may have intended data products disks, but they didn't do anything about it. And I don't really know whether they had intended data products disks or I don't remember.
Right.
I'm sure I knew at the time, but I don't remember now. And the first thing we had to learn about data products disks is that in spite of the fact they let you, they're divided into pages, and in spite of the fact that they give you an address inside a page, they won't let you start except at the beginning of a page. And so if you're going to swap somebody out, you can write continuous pages, but you can't, if the first person only uses half a page, you can't start saving the next person's files until the next page starts on the disk.
I see.
So that was one of the first challenges of using a disk, that in spite of the fact that you have the address, you can't use it. You can read, but you can't write. And then, and that helped a lot. It's much better to be on a disk than on a mag tape. And so we got a little bit more, Vern did the exec, and Vern Van Fleur, And so we could actually both be on the computer at the same time, which was handy. Then they delivered the drum. And of course, what you want to do is swap out pages, right? The users that aren't running at the moment, you want to put them on the drum. It's much faster than the disk.
Right.
And so you want to put them on the drum. You want to swap out half a dozen pages or so, and 3 or 4 pages, whatever. So I go to write these pages out on the drum. It turns out, as delivered, the drum can write a page and then does entire revolution before it will write the next page. And then it does another entire revolution before it will write the following page.
Is that just to get to whatever mechanism is writing?
Yep.
Okay.
So that wasn't adequate. So they sent out an engineer from Vermont Drum, and we spent about a week. He was changing the engineering, and I was running the code and adjusting the code to see what kind of code we could write that would get the drum to actually write continuous pages.
Wow.
And while he was changing the engineering, we tried a number of things. We finally got it. And so we invented a new instruction, and the drum eventually wrote, if you wrote out 4 pages, it wrote 4 pages. It didn't have to keep going round and round. And so, these are the early things that happen with a new computer. I mean, what can you, it's not, that's just, now, by that time then, we could actually run multiple users. And of course, then you get into all the different challenges of buffering and queuing and who goes next, and keeping track of whose interrupts are you waiting for at the moment. And in those very first days, all the echo was in the 940. That means if you type something on your teletype,
Right.
it had to go to the 940 and come all the way back to your teletype before you would see the print. And that's the way it started. So you had interrupts for every single character that was typed. This is fine if there's half a dozen users, no problem. But as you increase the number of users, you want to move the echo closer to the user.
Right.
So we'll get into that.
So that would be so that I'm sitting at a teleprinter, I'm connected to my Tymshare service, I'm connected to your computer, and what you're trying to prevent there is just a big lag between when I hit a key and when that teleprinter types that key on the piece of paper.
Right.
And so that, for the user experience, is
It's very important.
a priority job, if you will, the typing.
As long as you had a very few users, nobody could tell.
Right.
You had to get up to a fair number of users before you could tell that it wasn't the teletype that was doing the printing, before you
Right.
could tell that the printing was actually being driven by the computer.
And was that kind of the highest priority thing? Like if someone was typing,
Yes.
it was to give the user a
You-
decent typing
Yes.
experience.
Those interrupts took first priority.
Okay,
Yeah, you always echo.
interesting.
It doesn't take, more than a couple of instructions to do an echo.
Right.
Carriage returns were a little different because you had to make sure what they meant. Carriage returns had different meanings, but characters, any other character was just
Yeah. Just
very,
spit
very
it
quick.
back.
Just send it back.
With the
This is because we operated in full duplex. Not everybody initially operated in full duplex. You could operate in half duplex, in which case it would send the character to the computer, but half duplex meant that the teletype did the printing, not the machine.
And that was determined by?
That was just decision by the company.
By Tymshare.
Well, that was Tymshare's. We did full duplex because that was our decision.
Okay.
Our technical decision.
Okay. And in the half duplex, I would be sitting in my teleprinter, I would be typing, and it would.
It was just like a typewriter.
Right. Oh, okay. So something switched on in the teleprinter, so I'm typing, and then it sends as a batch of characters later, or
it sends out the characters as you type, but your typewriter just keeps working like a typewriter.
I see.
Your teletype is just like a typewriter at that point.
I see.
Except that it said something.
Oh, I think Marc wants to ask something.
So why did you decide to go full?
Why full duplex is Marc's question.
Lots of reasons. Because you get a great deal more. I wish I could remember all the good reasons, but you have a lot more control over the user and how you interpret a carriage return, when you interpret a carriage return, what that means. Do you want to end the session? Do you want to swap? All these things are tied up with your echo, and it's and as time went on, it became and we distributed. It became much better to be doing full duplex. Much better user experience. The user couldn't tell, but we had so much more information we could be working with right away.
You understood the context of that kind of character stream better.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so you could okay.
So we could do things.
With, to just take one little half step back, talking about the hard disks coming and the drum coming. The drum, I assume, is faster to read and write to, but had less capacity.
Way less.
So the drum is used to very quickly store kind of the state of the user's session at a particular moment?
Well, only one person can run at a time, right? And
right.
The 940 the 940 memory isn't very large.
Right.
So if you had queues for people who were running very short sessions. You had a queue for people who were running very short sessions. You could, depending on how much they use, but usually people who are running short sessions were also very frequently also had few pages. I mean, they were just doing something quick and testing something right there, and then, so the memory on the 940 would hold enough pages for one or two users. Mm-hmm. But if you had half a dozen people who, you get a carriage return, and then most people wait. There's they're looking at something. They want to figure something out or whatever and carriage returns is just sort of my example of a lot of things that can happen. But
yeah.
So you want to run another user. Well, there's one user in memory, and then there's 2 or 3 more users on the drum. And so you can swap them in or out quickly, and the next user, and so you don't waste any of the CPU time.
Okay.
Clearly, if you get users that require larger memories, you couldn't get much memory actually on the 940 mapped into your space. They were very restricted. But then sometimes you had to move some of these folks off to the drum. If you hadn't run for a while, your pages got moved to the disk
Okay.
automatically by the monitor in the background. So that if you're really studying something, you're not taking up expensive space. And other people who are trying to run actively get the extra memory in the computer and the memory on the drum.
And you are essentially writing kind of rules of thumb into your system to identify these situations so that you can put certain users one place and certain users in another place. This
You know
is
how much, you know how fast they're interacting all the time. You know how fast, you watch every carriage return, and you know whether or not they're going on or whether they're holding their breath or reading their code.
Yeah.
And so, your the monitor is aware of how fast users are coming back, whether they're typing immediately, they hit carriage return and then they take the next character, or whether they're holding their breath or reading what they wrote. And so the monitor's aware of all that. It's also, we only charge $10 an hour. Our only charge in the beginning was $10 an hour for connect time. So some people would take advantage of this and do big compute jobs. Now, it was supposed to be for these little test, engineering, my algorithm right tests, not for the big test when it was all put together, not for the running of the actual final result, which would be several hours of compute time.
right.
Well, when you only charge $10 an hour, you can get, and nothing for compute time. It turns out the compute time is pretty cheap. So then the monitor had to figure out which were these guys who are using up all the compute time, and how do you slow them down enough that it's not worth doing this? That you force them to use the computer they're supposed to be used because the price goes up because
They're paying per hour.
they're paying per hour, but you make their hours much longer than you would have made.
You give them more hours.
You give them
essentially.
more hours. They don't run as often, so they,
Right.
yes.
So a lot of what I would imagine would be the advantage of a time-sharing company are all of these decisions that you just talked about. To give the user a good experience. It seems like I'm just typing. It seems I'm the only user. I don't have to wait a long time. I run my little program, or I run a program from your library, and I get my result, and I sign off, and I used a half hour.
Yeah.
So much of it is about just listening to you, these timings of interpreting these
Yep.
character streams. I guess, how did you know even where to begin with making these rules about how to interpret these character streams, to know what to tell how did you tell the monitor what to do?
Well, I guess, I'd worked on a time-sharing system. I knew how they were supposed to react, and that I could figure out. And the big guys who were trying to use up lots of compute time without paying as much as they would have had to pay on their regular machine, you would only run a user for so many milliseconds. I mean, usually people got interrupted because they hit carriage return and they didn't do anything.
Right.
But the big compute programs, they ran for their 2 milliseconds or whatever it was, and then then the monitors stopped them. They didn't stop themselves. The monitor stopped them and put them back in the queue. And that's how you know that they are the people that are using up your computer time, your CPU time, so you put them in a queue that makes them wait. And people who end their session, hit carriage return, and then don't come back, those people, as fast as they want, when they do come back, they get run right away.
I see. So there's a maximum time that anybody can have the machine.
Right.
Or else it's just going to make everything laggy and
Right.
horrible. So you set a maximum time, and it's the people who are constantly using up the maximum.
Right. They go in the slow queue.
That's really, wow. That's very clever. Well, was it these sorts of issues that we've just been talking about that are the crux of making a time-sharing operating system?
Yeah.
Yeah. What I guess
How do you decide who's going to run next and how much time they get?
I guess it's really in the name, isn't it? It's about time management.
It's
How are
about
you
time
managing the resources of this one CPU? It's all about the time management.
Yeah.
That's fascinating. I had another question just on the tip of my tongue. It just went out of my mind. Were these some of the first computers that SDS was delivering to anyone, or had they had an earlier line of
they
machines?
had the 930 was a big line of computers.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
And no, they were
Well established.
well-established company, right?
Okay. Oh, yes, please, Hansen.
Was there any, from the business end, would Tymshare change the policy later to charge more?
Yes. Yes. They figured out that you needed to charge. They ended up charging for not just connect time, but also CPU time later on. But until they figured that out, I had to slow them down. And so, I'm not sure how much management ever figured out what all these little things we're talking about, like how long the guys had to wait who had to be interrupted by the monitor instead of by their use. And I'm not sure that how much the management of Tymshare knew what I was doing, but anyway, that's what I was doing and it worked.
Because that was fundamental to the whole economics of what the business was.
Right.
That if someone was trying to, I guess, game the price to get.
That's what they were doing, and and so.
So it's a kind of a game theory with the users.
Did you have to change it back later after they started charging? Did you give them more time?
I don't remember actually giving them much more later. I think they still paid because we never did charge, in my opinion, enough for compute time. It's just that we weren't losing money on them eventually. They were not our profitable business. They were not the profitable side of the business.
The idea had been get for the Tymshare co-founders to get the system and have local aerospace concerns as the customers.
And they delivered teletypes, which they used the phone system.
That's what I was just writing. Did Tymshare have a stable of teleprinters that they would? Teletypes.
DTY. Model 30, 10 characters a second.
Okay, yeah. And this was the kind of ubiquitous teletype.
Yes.
Yeah.
If you've ever seen a teletype, that's what it looks like.
Right. And did it have some sort of acoustic coupler for the telephone line? Okay.
For most, yeah.
And so the customer's paying for the phone call, and they're kind of renting the teletype from
Yes, from Tymshare.
From Tymshare. Okay.
Have you ever looked at you know, the software industry SIG page on the website, there's a picture on that website of a little girl sitting at a teletype with acoustic coupler. And so you can see what the whole
Setup.
arrangement is. That was
Yeah.
my daughter. My daughters have never lived in a house without access to a computer.
Wow.
And they're almost unique in their age group.
For their age cohort.
age. Mm-hmm.
Interesting.
Mm-hmm.
As you know, the system is delivered, it's in place. How long had you been? So I guess I'm still a little bit hazy about how you developed the operating system. Did it really come together once the computer was at hand?
Yeah.
Okay.
And all you know, as I say, the first Berkeley, we got a first draft from SDS, which was simply the Berkeley system.
Okay.
And and everything else I had to change. I mean, I had to add in all the drivers, had to worry about the queues, and lots of other issues, buffers here and there. How much you keep in memory, how much you put on the drum. None of this was there. So all of that was, yeah.
We talked about before earlier at IBM how it was flow charts and then coding sheets and cards.
Well, they
and
were more
listings.
organized than I was.
Yeah. Well, that's my question. How did you, when you were developing this operating system, how'd it go?
They had there was the design, there was code there.
Yeah.
And so you knew they had enough code there and they'd run enough users that you knew that there weren't major holes in the design. We added system calls, which we called BRSs, which I don't know what that stood for anymore, but and we added a lot of those so that users could do specific things, ask the operating system to do specific things, which they had a few, but we had to add a lot more because we were giving users a lot more to work with. And so that was another part of the addition to the operating system. And once this was done, of course, moving on, in '68, Leroy came, and we had known him over at Livermore. And it was, this is very interesting because when I went to Tymshare in '66, early on, Leroy came over and proposed to Dave that he come in and build a network so that they wouldn't be limited to local phone calls. And this was another thing that had never crossed their mind, either Tom or Dave. I mean, it's just like, this was even more strange than asking for a teletype at home. It's like a network. We're here. What do you mean? What are you talking about? All our customers are local. Well, 2 years later, all our customers weren't local, and so they hired Leroy, and that was the beginning of TimeNet.
Because within 2 years, you had people phoning in from
other places,
call,
and they had installed the computer in Los Angeles, and it suddenly became clear that they had a whole country worth of customers, not just a Silicon Valley worth of customers, but an entire country worth of customers, and that people weren't going to call in from long distance, and it was extremely expensive to install a 940 in every city around the country and build up the staff to manage the machine room and all of that. So.
And is that so it did come to pass that these aerospace companies locally were the customers, and then their colleagues at the other laboratories or facilities in Los Angeles said, this sounds fantastic?
Yep.
And did they, so how did it come to be? Were they phoning up, or then were they asking for like a local number?
They phoned long distance, and
Okay.
then we installed a computer down there. We had a big computer center in Los Angeles
Because you could see the demand coming.
because the demand was there.
You thought it would expand it even more if they wouldn't have to make a long distance call.
Right.
Which must be almost cost as much as the computer.
Yeah, I mean, Texas also had big engineering problem issues and opportunities. I mean, the petroleum
Right.
oil industry does a lot of engineering. And so there's huge, there's another installation in Houston, and I mean, where does this stop? Help.
How many, so there was.
We got to about 3 and quit.
Okay, Los Angeles and then Houston.
Yeah, and
Okay.
and at that and by that time, the first stage of the network was ready to go. And
So that was very quick that you did those
yeah,
within 2-3 years
yeah,
or something?
yeah.
Okay.
We had, as I say, the machine came in about September of '66. In June of '67, was SDS wanted to sell more machines, but they needed an operating system and that worked. And so Harvard was going to be one of the places to sell another SDS machine, but Harvard, being Harvard, had a very complicated, extensive acceptance test. And they had an SDS back there with all the same configuration that we had. With
The drum, the
drum, the
disc.
disc, yeah, and the paper type reader and all that stuff. So SDS asked, there were 5 companies at that point that were running 940s with the Berkeley operating system. So they had everybody go try to see if they could pass the Harvard acceptance test. And because, of course, SDS was selling a multi-million-dollar machine, it sounded they could afford to send people back there. You got 2 weeks to try this out. They got around to Tymshare after the other 4 had failed to ever pass the test. And so they finally got around to us, and we went back. I went back. We had one thing that didn't pass on the first day, fixed that night. The next day, so in 2 days instead of 2 weeks, we passed their acceptance test. And I think it's interesting why Tymshare, the values of Tymshare and the sort of the whole spirit of the company put something together where our priorities were to make something useful to the customer first and foremost, not to make the code fancy or, other interesting things that programmers like to do. But the first and foremost priority was to make it good for the customer. And I think that was a very, very fundamental to Tymshare's priorities. And I think it's why we managed to sell our operating system to SDS instead of everybody else. And I think it's because the Tymshare focused on customers.
Who were those other 4? Were they other time-sharing companies?
We acquired most of them.
But at the time, before you absorbed them, they were...
Yeah, they were just time-sharing companies.
Okay.
Just like, yeah.
Okay. Well, please.
Do you remember the name?
Mark's asking if you remember any of the names of the...
Well, there was Dial Data and ComShare were 2 of them, and I'd have to think about it to remember the others.
Was there any thought about acquiring the Berkeley Computer Company that the GENIE folks had started, or was there any relationship with them?
No. They were, no. They, no, they were, that wasn't one of the, I think they were more academic, and I think this difference, we acquired dial data, we knew Tymshare, they were not as focused on the general, making it generally available to the marketplace. They might have a specific marketplace, or they might have something else, but general usefulness was not as much of a focus other places as it was at Tymshare.
Were some of these people other programmers like yourself, like other people at Tymshare, who had kind of, early on been exposed to time sharing and were more focused to time sharing as a technology than time sharing as a consumer-facing business?
Well, I suspect. All the rest of them were men. I knew that. And I think they were more academic. By that time, their schools were teaching some, at least you heard of computers in college. And,
Yeah.
and I got all my training at IBM, which is customer-oriented.
Oh.
And they weren't for how fancy, can you take this, can you make this, can you write this in two lines instead of 3? And but academics are not like that. They're more like, it's more important to be able to get it all crammed into 2 lines or whatever the academic thing is at the moment.
Right.
and so IBM was really focused on making it work for the customer. And so I think that's where all my background came from. And I think that made a difference. And of course, it wasn't in a vacuum. Tom and Dave were also very customer focused.
Right, as I guess a consummate salesperson
Yes.
is
Tom was,
by definition
yes,
the customer's ally.
Right.
When your operating system passed that Harvard acceptance test, can you talk about when SDS wanted to offer your operating system, as their offering as well? How did that go? Did you give them a license or?
I wasn't involved.
Oh.
That was above my grade. Dave licensed it to them.
Okay.
And they delivered it from them on.
Was that a profitable decision for Tymshare, that license, or was it giving kind of the crown jewels to anybody who could now just buy one of these systems?
I don't think it hurt I don't think we got competition from people.
Okay.
I think we could have, Dave and I disagreed on how much we could charge for that. Because I'd been with a salesman back there at Harvard, the guy who was going to make all the money if only somebody could write an operating system that would pass this test. So I had a better insight into how much they were willing to pay for an operating system.
To make that sale.
To make that sale, and he knew, and of course the salesman knew how many other sales were hanging if we could only do this.
Right, probably especially if you sell it to a high prestige place like Harvard,
right.
then
You get a
you're
lot
not
of,
going to get fired for
a lot of
buying
coverage.
one. Yeah.
So, so we didn't always agree, but it went out, and it certainly didn't impact our Tymshare grew as fast as it could grow.
Yeah.
It didn't have any problem with that.
Initially, you were offering people, time for $10 an hour, and kind of run what you will.
Yeah.
At what point does the company start offering like a library of application software?
Very soon. Let's see, what was I going to say? I was going to say a couple of interesting things. When we first started, we let people program in assembler. We cut assembler out very early. because, as I say, we really got our first customers up in October. Before the end of the year, we had people trying to hack the system.
Within how long from
3
that?
months.
From 3 months of having that first machine.
We had people trying to crash the system.
Dialing in from a teleprinter, putting in a false account number or
Well,
something?
they had to be from one of our customers in the beginning. They had to be, but if you license this to a corporation with a bunch of engineers and the machine's there at night, what do these engineers like to do? They like to play. I understand that. So the first thing they did was play with this computer and see if they could work there, see if they could crash it.
If there's something about crashing it means that you know how it works.
Right, exactly.
Is there a way to play around and know how it works and not crash the machine?
Probably not. You
So
probably do get some insights from crashing the machine.
Okay.
And
So there's a rationale behind it. It's not just purely destructive.
it's not purely destructive. Yeah,
Okay.
I'm sure it is sometimes, but most of the time it's just curiosity.
It's a kind of a test to failure sort of thing.
Yeah, it's curiosity. How did they do this? How did they do this? And you just keep pushing on the timing and the characters and yeah.
And so how did you respond to that?
Well, besides taking out
Oh,
besides taking out the assembler, so I added a lot of, so I had to make a lot of the original Berkeley code more secure. There were places where you could end up in sort of a in-between state, and so I had to clean those out.
I guess when they crash it, they're revealing to you a new place to work on.
Yeah. They were job security. But people who think that this hacking is new or recent or something, no. 3 months before the end of 1966, they were crashing the machine. So
And it's
This is not
and
new.
it's the customers.
the customers. The customers were crashing the machine. The customers, because the customers we were selling to engineers.
Yeah.
Engineers who can program like to do this stuff. What can you say?
Did you ever do any of that?
I'm not telling.
I'll take that as a yes. I can't remember Leroy's last name. It's
Times.
Times.
T-Y-M-E-S.
Yes, I should have been able to remember that.
And he is no relation to Tymshare. That was the strangest coincidence.
But he had, it was in '66 that he originally made the suggestion about the network. And
And of course, this was from Livermore. He knew about time-sharing. He could see how useful the time-sharing system was at Livermore to the various divisions.
oh,
He could,
yeah.
he had the whole image. He had the image. They came from General Electric, Tom and Dave, and GE just didn't have nearly as developed, sophisticated a system. So there wasn't nearly as much you could do with the GE system. So the customer base just couldn't expand the way it did at Tymshare. At Tymshare, we had, by the late 60s, we had primitive spreadsheets, software, editor, Word, nothing remotely like Word, but
A text editor.
if you can imagine the first level, first design, first editor kind of program, yeah, we had all of that very early. So you could do a lot of work. You could write reports, you could, keep spreadsheets and accounting and all kinds of things. So the general usage, the number of things you could do with our computers were just enormous.
Who was building these entries in your applications library, like the accounting programs and the text programs?
In the beginning, it was two guys, Richard Moore and Arden Scott.
did they work for you, or did they work in a separate?
No, they didn't work
separately?
for me.
Okay.
It took a while before Dave could convince himself that a woman could be a manager.
How long?
It never happened.
Well, how long did
He left in '69.
Ah,
And so after that, things changed enough that there was just nobody else to make the manager of some of this
Right.
software, system software stuff. They tried, when I got pregnant in '67, right after the Harvard acceptance test, the first thing that Dave did was run out and hire Norm, my husband. He never interviewed, they knew Norm because there were company
Sure.
parties and things.
sure.
And they knew he was in computers. So they ran out and hired Norm. They never interviewed him, never asked him any questions. They assumed that since he was my husband, he knew everything. He had basically written the operating system, and I was just faking it. And all kinds of other fairly interesting.
Did
things.
they ask you before that?
No, they never even told me they were going to hire him. They just went out and hired him. And so here's a funny story. This has a funny ending. So they make him the manager. I've told you about Norm. What he likes to do is go around to every project and make a little bit of code, solve a really hard problem in
Yeah.
code. Managing is not what he likes to do. But I was, I was not managing officially because women can't do that, but I was sort of organizing things. And so they just assumed he was better at everything anything I did. So then everything, okay, so this is the end of the year. My daughter, I'm still doing all the coding on the monitor. So I'm working on, one night, we have a lot of things I want to tie up, and my daughter's birth is actually due the next day. So I'm working until midnight, and I got everybody's requests settled. Monitor was tested, the operators agreed, everything's working fine. So that was midnight. My daughter was born at 9 o'clock the next morning. And
Did you go home before going to the hospital, or did
I
you?
was at home because we had a terminal to home. I was
okay.
at home. I didn't,
Okay.
it wasn't that bad. And by 3 o'clock the next afternoon, I'm lying in the hospital. Dave Schmidt calls. He said, our best customer has one more feature. They want in the operating system. Could I bring a terminal over?
To the
To
hospital?
the hospital.
That's good. Wow.
I said, no, thank you. I'll be home in 2 days. Why don't I fix it when I get home? And so, so that worked out okay. The irony of all this is that when they handed out stock options the year before, they decided they couldn't they gave me a few, but very few, less than half of what they gave any of the men, even though some of the men were essentially working for me. But they gave me very few stock options. And the reason Dave Schmidt gave me was because we can't give you a woman stock options because stock options the intent of stock options is to keep you interested and active in the company, and it would be immoral to tempt a woman to continue to work instead of stay home and have children. And then Dave Schmidt, who won't give me stock options because I'm supposed to be home having children, is the one who calls me while I'm still in the hospital and wants to bring me a teletype.
As you say, people are mutually or internally inconsistent, I guess, is,
Yeah.
Was he, would you say he was typical of people in his position?
Let me just say,
Yeah.
I really like Dave.
Yeah.
He was a good manager.
Yeah.
We're still friends. It was just the time. And he and Tom had both come from GE. Now, let me tell you my GE story. I hope I don't keep you all afternoon.
Please keep us all afternoon, and please.
So one time I finally got annoyed that I wasn't getting into stock options and all the men who were working for me were getting stock options. So GE happened to be advertising for somebody, a programmer with my experience. And so I sent them my resume. And I called them up the next week and I talked to the woman in personnel and said, I sent you my resume, can I interview for a job? And she said, well, it is true that your resume fulfills our requirements better than any of the others we have received, but we do not hire women in technical positions. And besides that, you have management experience, and we can't possibly ask a GE man to ever work for a woman. And so you can understand Tom and Dave coming from that context, that environment, why the thought of having a woman doing any of this was just not within their, not in their program. Just wasn't there. And
that GE operation is, or was, located in the Bay Area, correct? That was where their time-sharing computing was.
This is basically where Tom and Dave had come from.
Was it on the peninsula or the East Bay? Yeah,
right over here.
Okay.
And
was that based on the MIT project?
No, it was a very, I forget what they called it now, but it was a very limited system and GE system. And it's what I think I said. It's what Tom and Dave thought they were going to sell until GE pulled the rug out from under them, and then they got into SDS, for which they were very grateful because it was a much better system. And but GE at that time was just not. This was, late 1970 maybe, I don't know, 69, 70, right in that time frame. There was a non-discrimination law passed in 64, which one would think they couldn't just announce to you over the phone that we don't hire women, but.
Well, I guess they and many other people were just ignoring it, or?
Yeah. You could admit, actually, it's a good thing they passed the laws because 20 years later they made a difference, but they didn't make a difference for 10 to 20 years.
Why is that? Because it relied on actually people bringing lawsuits based upon the law, I guess.
Actually, the people who brought the lawsuits in the beginning all lost. I think what it took was a generation of new managers.
Yeah. I was thinking about, you were talking about the people from Tymshare who had who in 1966, there was this thought, there would never be a competition between us because we're in these different regions. I guess at the point around 68 or maybe it's even 67 when the Los Angeles installation is there, the Houston one is maybe being built, and you're deciding, Tymshare is deciding, perhaps we do need to build this network. Then I guess once you make the decision to build a network, then there is no regionalization.
There's no international.
Everybody's it's all competition now.
It's all competition now. And I think Tymshare, I don't know, but I think Tymshare had a more directed, they were in Michigan, they were probably, although we had huge customers from the automobile industry. So I'm not sure why there wasn't more problem with Tymshare, but they seem to have been more limited and more focused in what they were doing. And we didn't have to just kill Tymshare because at that point we were worldwide. We had nodes in Paris and Japan and everywhere, so we were not very limited in where our customer base was.
Wow. Well, maybe, hopefully Marc is beaming back in because
Hi, yeah.
yeah.
Hi there.
Hey, Marc.
I don't know what happened. Just wouldn't let me back for like 5 minutes.
Yeah, I was worried that the battery ran out. We were just talking a few moments ago about, kind of getting into the TimeNet story. So I'm glad to have you back on. Maybe we could, I don't know what everybody's time is like. Are you good, Eric? Okay. Maybe we could at least get into the beginnings of the TimeNet story.
Beginning of TimeNet?
Yeah.
Well, it was very gradual. And one of the first things we did build these, we bought. Our first nodes were purchased. And they were the ones who the first thing we did was move the echo out into the nodes and then had the nodes communicate back to the SDS. So that was the first step in
of the network.
Of the network. It wasn't anywhere. It was just a matter of having local phone calls for people everywhere, and then the nodes connect. Otherwise, there was no change to anybody.
But what were the nodes? Were they mini computers?
They were mini computers. And we migrated from one to another fast enough that I can't remember them all.
Mm-hmm.
And, but they are written, it is written down someplace. Which I'd be happy to send you if you're actually interested, if you remind me.
So that was, I'm a customer would have a local phone number. It would reach this mini computer, and it was essentially, was its primary purpose to provide the echo for the typing, or was it also doing some sort of scheduling?
It did nothing except the echo and forwarding the
Pass it
information.
on.
Its primary purpose was a local phone call.
Okay, and then you leased maybe an open line between.
Yes, then we got lease lines from there back to whatever the local computer center was. And
Did you expand the number of computer centers?
we ended up with 3 computer centers.
Okay. It was.
Here, Houston, and in New Jersey.
Oh, and you closed down the
We
Los
closed
Angeles.
on Los Angeles
And took that machine.
and moved it to one of the computer centers.
Okay.
All the computer centers had multiple machines. I'm not sure where that one went.
Okay.
But,
When did you open the New Jersey center?
geez, I don't remember.
Was it
Early,
early-ish?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
yeah.
And that was for financial customers primarily, or I guess there's all sorts?
Everything.
Yeah. Well, yes, Marc?
And each of the centers was running the same operating system, the same basic suite of applications, just very
Yes.
Each place was
Each
kind of
place
a
ran
copy.
exactly the same thing. And one of my biggest disappointments in life is that we put one in Paris, and I brought up so many remote computers by that time, I didn't even have to go to Paris to get the machine running.
Well, maybe could we, so that seems like a very straightforward network.
Yeah.
Initially. Was there,
It got very sophisticated.
right. Well, I'm interested at this point, at the very beginning of TimeNet, at the very beginning of Timeshare's network, what was the
Wasn't even
land?
timed at that point. It was, yeah. It was
Okay.
just a network.
The company's network.
And And basically, it wasn't obvious to anybody. It wasn't even a network, because all they were mini computers with lines back into the host. They weren't networked together. It was just a line back to the host.
A kind of a hub and a spoke.
So the hosts didn't talk to each other.
And the
The
mini
nodes.
computers didn't talk to each other, and the hosts didn't talk to each other, right?
So where did the idea, I mean, it was Leroy that came up with it, wanted to apply a true network to it.
When did the idea come to make it a true network where all the elements?
We always knew we were going to do that.
Okay.
It's you start in the basics, you get the most important thing done so that customers have a local phone call, and then you move out. I mean, not everybody. Norm, Leroy, and I always knew what it was going to be. You can't start. Again, it's customer-oriented company. We didn't have to do the most sophisticated network in the world before we could announce it. We could start with the simplest network, which helped the customers because they had local phone calls, and grow from there.
And
What were
oh, sorry, Mark, go ahead.
what were the models you were looking to? Sage?
The models for a network that you were, what models for networks were you thinking of for computer networks? Sage, Sabre?
No, this was quite original.
Okay. And was it,
In terms of the architecture of TimeNet, it was original.
okay. I was just wondering why, was the idea that, you would maybe start off with these nodes, this hub and spoke sort of arrangement on your way to building out maybe a more interconnected network? Was the idea then that you would be shifting customers from, one computer center to another, in essence doing kind of like a meta time sharing across the network, or?
You couldn't shift them because they all had their information on the host that they were accustomed to.
So
you had to forward them to the host that
To their host.
To their host.
then by having more interconnection, what was the kind of the theory of that? What would be the advantage?
This is a very long answer.
I'll
Well, first of all, you could call in from anywhere to the host you wanted, because you were now on a network. You weren't on a mini computer to a host. You were on a network, and you could connect to any of the hosts from any of these little mini computers in the field.
Okay.
So that was one big advantage, that people could travel around, and if we wanted to move a customer from one host to another, we had their data. For one reason or another, we wanted to take that host and dedicate it to some other big customer and get this little guy over to another host. Not a problem, because you were on a network and you could go wherever you wanted. After we got it up and TimeNet basically up and running, and I can't remember right now all those steps. If you really want to know all those steps, you need to talk to Norman Leroy.
Mm-hmm.
But once we got TimeNet up and running, these little mini computers that were all over the world, and they were all over the world, we could put in a lot of interesting code on these mini computers. So we could do a lot of we did a lot of network communications. If you wanted to talk to a network over here or a computer that wasn't necessarily ours, we could do translations in these mini computers. So one of the things we did was, as he just mentioned, connecting to airline hosts, doing airline reservations. Well, every airline, you put a teletype in we managed to get a little better than a teletype by this time, but a terminal in an office, travel agent office, and they would need to talk to different airlines to make reservations. Every airline had their own protocol. So what we could do is the travel agent could type in what they wanted, reservation on such and such a airline, and we could translate that request into that airline's protocol right there in the mini computer. We never had to go through our computer. So that was one example of the kinds of things that we ended up doing. We would benefit, Tymshare would benefit, because sometimes some of these transactions, they also needed to use the SDS or one of our other computers for more of the reservation system. So we sort of benefited both ways around.
I see. As a way to drive increased business, increased use of your computers, you allow this interconnection.
And sometimes we just charge for it. And if you weren't going to our computer, you were just going to an airline, then we would just charge for that service.
Right. Huh. With the network then, that as Tymshare was building this network, was it then that each of the nodes, each of these mini computers, were then connected to, not necessarily to each other, but to each of the big computer facilities of Tymshare?
Each mini computer was connected. Some were connected to the host. Many were connected just to each other. Just like
I see.
just exactly like the demo downstairs, or I guess back there. Just like that demo, it shows you how packet switching works. It's all packet switched, and so by interconnecting these little mini computers, if one line got crowded, you send it on another one.
And were they leased telephone lines between? Okay, so you're using the leased AT&T phone lines to connect all of these mini computers together, and including some direct connections to hosts, but not all of the mini computers then necessarily would have a host connection.
Most of the mini computers did not have a host connection.
Okay, right, because you
just
have
like in the picture.
these cheaper local leased lines, and then by doing the packet switching, you can get it to the host.
Yep.
Cheaper than having an open long distance line across the
much
country.
Cheaper. And of course, we could put mini computers in front of American Airlines, and there were a lot of examples. That's just one. You could put mini computer, and then you could have travel agents talk to American Airlines. It didn't matter where they were. They could get to the American Airlines host.
As long as you had, it's an interesting blend of there's this kind of co-location, if you will, of having your mini computer, some of your mini computers close, physically close, geographically close.
They had to be close to the host. There had to be one close to the host.
Right.
But all the rest of them were all over the world.
That's fascinating. So it's a mixture of just distributing enough around of the mini computers, but having at least a few close to these important hosts.
Yes, right.
Yours and other people's.
And other people's. And the rest are distributed. I mean, I told you what our three computer centers were, and but you could stick a mini computer anywhere. They're very inexpensive. You can stick them anywhere. That means some company can have local dial-up, and it doesn't matter where in the world their computer is.
Mark, did you have a question here?
Yeah, sorry.
That's no.
I read the time that was circuit switched. At least, yes.
Circuit switched
Yes.
TimeNet, and then changed to packet switched?
Yes.
Okay.
When did it switch to packet?
I believe that was in the early 70s.
Okay.
And it wasn't later than that. Whether it was 70 or 72 is what I can't remember.
So
It's one or the
it's
other.
the original architecture where it was the hub and spoke, where
Yeah.
the mini computers directly to the host was circuit switched.
Circuit
But
switched.
then once you had this network where the mini computers were networked to each other, that was packet.
Packet switched, right.
That makes a lot more sense.
And
Sorry.
No.
Thank you, very good.
Thanks.
That's exactly right.
Um,
Good question.
I would imagine that the idea of, well, correct me if I'm wrong, that a packet switched network of this kind at that time was extraordinarily rare. I mean, I guess
It was
there's ARPANET. Are there others that
Well, I don't
you
know.
were following?
I don't know, but it was certainly the only one that anybody could buy onto. There were no others that you could buy into and just use. However, as far as I could tell, it was the only one that was just open to the public to buy into.
I think BBN had one that was there or something.
Yeah, I don't,
ARPANET?
I haven't looked that up for a while, so I don't remember all the details. But TimeNet was all over the world, and with their little mini computers.
How fast did that occur?
Well, Leroy came in '68, and it was no later than 71, 72, and it was worldwide. Packet
Wow.
switched. Leroy's good.
Wow.
Leroy is
that
really
is
good.
astounding. What kind of places did you put the mini computers, just in terms of like a physical?
In office closets.
You would rent an office and stick
No,
it in a closet? Or?
yes, we could rent an office, or we might have a sales office there and stick it in the closet. Or, if somebody out in the boonies wants a connection, they give us a shelf in their office, and we'd stick our mini computer in there, and that was it.
And give them maybe a reduced,
Yeah.
or give them a payment of some kind for that.
Yeah.
That's fascinating.
They went anywhere. They went in very strange places.
And was it difficult? Was Tymshare paying for this big build out of its earnings, or was it taking on debt, or was it difficult to finance?
No, it wasn't. It was really. Tymshare was so lean. They had one person doing the monitor. They had one person writing all the TimeNet. Leroy, for years, Leroy was the only person who knew what was in that network code. For years, I was the only person who knew what was in the monitor. So they weren't spending money on any extra employees, because two of their most critical software pieces were held up by two people.
Wow.
And so no, they could really do an awful lot of expansion under earnings, with the earnings. They did get some more money, but they were very profitable.
And it did go public in the early 70s?
In the early 70s.
Okay. And what was the experience of that like for you and the other people in the company?
We hardly noticed.
Really?
right. It was all of them.
Hmm.
It made so the act of going public wasn't, I think we had a party or something.
Uh-huh.
But beyond having a party, it didn't impact any of the worker, the employees. It did make us more visible. And it did give us money to do some acquisitions that we probably couldn't have done. The combination of the investment and the visibility probably gave us the resources to do some of the acquisitions that happened in the 70s. And so that changed things a lot.
Was Leroy in the programming he was doing for the network?
Mm-hmm.
How did that? How was that related to the sort of programming work that you were doing? Was there any need to coordinate
Oh,
those
yeah.
two things?
Because
there was.
as the, well, SDS came, the 940 came with, I can't remember what they call them, but some communications interface. And then, of course, we had to change, first thing we had to do was change the echo. And then we had to change out the hardware because we used a mini computer instead of the whatever SDS delivered. And, you know, as the network developed, yes, there were after that minor changes, but those were the two big changes.
And Leroy was writing the software that would go.
Well, I
on
wrote the
mini-
software that yes, Leroy wrote the mini computer and I wrote the monitor.
Okay.
Yeah. And, you know, we both knew what needed to get done, so it wasn't.
Right, you knew what was
Yeah,
happening.
we knew what
where
the
they had
interface
to-
was, so it wasn't a big deal.
Let's see.
Just replace some of that interrupt code.
And was it, well, I guess as you were building out TimeNet, was the company aware of these other, I guess, governmental and military packet switch computer networks that were being
Oh, yes.
built? Okay.
Leroy and Norm were very involved, very much aware of. And I think, yeah, you'd probably have to talk to them, but I think they had conversations with some of the ARPANET folks.
I would imagine it would be a pretty small community of people.
It was a very small community.
and much of it right here.
Yes,
on
and
the
it's local,
peninsula.
yeah.
Yeah.
I don't, and they were in different worlds, they were delivering to different worlds. And so comparing the technology was not a problem. It was never an issue that we talked about, the technology. And they can give you a lot of details about that I find fascinating, but they weren't my area of expertise. You should talk to the experts about them.
Okay. I'm sorry, Mark?
Did you see Telenet and CompuServe?
Telenet and CompuServe.
Yeah, Yeah.
What was your?
they were competition.
Anyone else that was providing networking for business?
Well, those are the only two I remember, but that doesn't mean there weren't others. I was so buried inside the monitor that what was going on out there. And early in the 70s, we did, you know, at the time we went public, we did a lot of acquisitions. I was involved in a lot of the acquisitions, and then once we got them in, one of the things that Tymshare on their shoestring did not do very well was their accounting system. And so we acquired Graphic Controls, which is another funny story, up in Buffalo. and Buffalo, New York. If you've ever been to Buffalo, you'll understand this story. We acquired Graphic Controls, and they had a much better accounting system than we had. So in the early 70s, one of the things I managed was the conversion of Tymshare's accounting system to sort of an expanded, enhanced Buffalo Graphic Controls accounting system, and that's a lot of work. And then we kept acquiring companies, and so we had to keep adjusting our accounting system to account for all these other companies that were coming in.
What were all these other companies? Surely some were other time-sharing companies that you were acquiring, but were others kind of like companies providing a service, if you will?
Some of them were, some of them were just computers, so people could bring their programs in and run them because there was a computer here, and take them home the next morning or whatever. The big one was United Data Centers, UDC. That came with Bernie Goldstein and Al Eisenstadt. Since I can't remember names, you better write those down quick before I forget them.
And was that a time-sharing firm?
No. They were a more batch processing firm, and they did a lot of, I guess taxes may have been part of their work, one of their customers. But they were batch processing. They understood the value of getting their work on a network, but they had no interactive capability on any of their machines. It was all batch. Now, there's nothing against running batch. Send in you can ship over your mag tape and we'll mount it and run your programs, and you can do what you want with them. So it wasn't that we had anything against running batch processing. It's just that our basic was interactive.
And that was just to expand your offerings to people who wanted to do batch processing.
Exactly.
Now you could offer anything,
Yeah.
right?
Mm-hmm.
I'm sorry,
Yeah.
Hansen. I think.
I was just wondering if there was any thought to converting those programs to Tymshare.
We did. Some of them we did, and particularly tax processing became very interactive.
Well, it just strikes me from listening to you that the company must have been, it seems like it was enjoying just a tremendous amount of growth and financial success.
Right.
And was it, but not so much growing in terms of headcount. Is that true?
Well, it certainly grew in terms of the sales force.
Oh.
You have to be in place, and you have to talk to customers, and so sales force grew. But I wouldn't say that the developer group didn't grow, but it grew more slowly relative to the size of the company.
And the company established sales offices around
Everywhere.
Everywhere.
Here, there, and everywhere, right?
Earlier we were talking about, you remarked that I guess it was by the end of the 70s, you became a VP for the company, and that, we were talking earlier, you were a VP of a Fortune 500 company. When did Tymshare make it onto that?
It was in the early 80s.
That was in the early
Yeah.
80s. Okay.
Right.
So it was was it just a kind of like a
It was just a
exponential
continuous,
thing?
Yeah. Now, one of the things we talked about UDC and that acquisition, that changed the company a lot. Not because of the business, but because of Bernie Goldstein.
Huh.
And he had, you know, I've told you where Tom and Dave were coming from. David had left in '69, but Tom was still there, and his interests hadn't, you know, he was happy to have the company grow, but developing a monster company or something was never something he was anxious to do.
Okay.
He enjoyed what he was doing, didn't expand it very much. You know, I mean, here we are, a Fortune 500 company, so it expanded it quite a bit. But in terms of developing out and doing new kinds of products and that wasn't so much his interest. We were doing a lot of airline reservation systems in the late 70s and early 80s. We were doing a lot of online banking for, you know, working with banks to figure out how do you do some of these financial transactions online. So we had a lot of very interesting very early applications, very early activity in what now we'd never think twice about.
Yeah.
But we actually probably did the first from home online airline reservation. And one time we were I remember being in Italy on a business, and we didn't know when we were going to come home, you know, when the meetings were going to be over. We made our reservations online in Italy. Because by that time we were no longer using teletypes. We were using terminals that you could actually carry around. And so we could make our airline reservations from Italy to come home.
Wow. And
This is 70s.
This is a portable
It's
terminal.
It's a little portable terminal, right?
CRT?
No.
No.
No, it was,
Silent 700.
He says.
Like a silent 700.
yeah. It's,
So it was akin to
it looked like a
teletype?
typewriter, only it connected to the phone line.
and it would automatically, you know, it would get information in and print it.
Yeah.
Wow. Wow. And an acoustic coupler, just like the
Yeah,
other things.
that's right.
Wow. And that's,
So way, way early compared to what people think about. I mean, I've told somebody I was in the computer industry for, you know, my career, and they said, "What did you do? The computers didn't come until 1990s." So no, I mean, but that's just when people think about it,
yeah.
and they don't realize how much preceded what happened in the 90s to make that possible. You can't just make everything out of, you know, start from the whole. You have to start gently, quietly, slowly.
So when
That
you,
was fun.
with the banking and the airlines, you were both helping banks and airlines to figure out how to do kind of online transactions?
Right.
Okay. And the idea would be Tymshare would be, or they would use TimeNet to make these offerings to their customers, and you would collect a fee, or how would it?
Well, it varied all over the place.
Yeah.
A lot of times, somewhere along the way, Tymshare had kept the accounting, for example, or of some of these for some of these transactions. So we knew what was going on, and they would take the reservation. We'd keep some of the accounting information for them.
I see.
Online banking was really the same. There's a lot. If somebody's going to pay a bill online, write a check or something, there's a lot of information that you want to keep for them.
Right.
So,
And that would be where TimeNet or
Tymshare
Tymshare would.
do that, and TimeNet would get it delivered to the right office and the right customer. And
At a certain point, video terminals, in the 70s, I guess, are becoming more commonplace. So is Tymshare continuing in this business of renting or leasing teletypes and then video terminals to customers, or?
Yeah, they were much more sophisticated by the 70s. They were little portable terminal, like Marc was mentioning. But yes, we could still rent them, or you could buy them.
Was it becoming more common for customers to buy their own equipment?
Well, let me try to think about the timing here. Late 70s, early 80s, PCs were coming in, and we could connect to them, and so there was a wide range of what we were doing.
Yeah, that's what I was wondering about, because the video terminal is just a kind of baby step to these personal computers that I guess could very easily connect to.
Yeah, we did a lot of work with TWA. We got early the early Apple and Apple II and at home. And so we could do a lot of this from home. We could make airline reservations. We could store information. Kids could write up stuff and store it on the mainframe, and and get it back or send it to some. And of course, there was an early version of email. It wasn't called email, but it was an early version of. So they could send it around, and it was all there.
That email was for. Was that a service offered by Tymshare that companies could use, or?
You could use it we certainly used it internally.
Yeah.
And there certainly was messaging for people who had accounts could send messages.
To other people.
To other people.
Who had accounts.
Who had accounts, but it was very limited.
Was that kind of like putting a message on a server somewhere and then somebody would go and look at it?
Yeah. It wasn't as it wasn't as sophisticated as email, but on the other hand, when I was traveling around the world here and there, I would send email, and my kids and I would communicate through email. So because we could get on free, there's a local phone call.
Yeah.
I could send them messages about what was going on. Yeah. So
Was it acquisitions
it's in
that
the
was
70s. That's in the late 70s. So that you're talking about.
Yeah.
Messaging from Italy to.
And you're on one of these portable
On one of those.
teletypes
And they're on
the Apple II at home. Well, was it for these acquisitions that you were traveling so much internationally, or what was?
Well, it depended. We did a big contract with Edelcable, which is why I was in Rome so often. And Italy turned out to be, their communications wasn't as up to date as ours. They were entirely teletypes. And Edelcable was in charge of all of Italy's international communications. And for things like email or messages or anything everybody used to do on teletypes, they still did on teletypes, and we did on email or something equivalent over here. So we worked with the Eagle cable and completely converted them off of the teletypes onto using a TimeNet communication system, so they could send messages from Eagle cable to various offices around.
Wow.
Yeah, it was fascinating.
So that was almost like a national infrastructure project.
Mm-hmm.
And they were building their part of their national telecommunications infrastructure on top of TimeNet.
TimeNet.
Did they have any concerns about lack of control or ownership of it?
Well, certainly not in the beginning. I'm sure that as time went on, but then they came over, they sent a couple of their people over here, and they were here for a couple of years. So they really understood networks before they went back, and we didn't. We were here to tell them everything about networks.
Right.
So we were getting a lot of payment in this transition period. They went back and built their own. That was fine with us.
Okay. So in essence, they were developing expertise in modern networking by the collaboration with
Right.
Tymshare, TimeNet,
Right.
and then built their own infrastructure.
Yeah.
Wow. And was that a state-owned firm?
Eagle Cable was kind of like AT&T.
Okay. A state-owned firm and everything but the name.
State controlled.
Yeah, regulated monopoly or something like that. Wow. And how did that connection come about?
We just realized they needed some help. What can you do? I mean,
Were there other kind of national infrastructure projects or regional infrastructure projects like that before, like Georgia or another country or another region?
I don't know that they were like that. We were everywhere. So many things changed. So many countries came to use TimeNet that in one way or another. I don't know. I'm not sure there was anything exactly equivalent to Eagle Cable, but.
Did you have, did you have kind of governments as customers? So, for example, did you have governments or state agencies as customers for TimeNet or for Tymshare?
National Institute of Health, right here, was one of the first big TimeNet customers.
Because they put their library or their bibliographical database or something
Yep,
on
made
there?
it, available everywhere. Yes, and it pretty much, once that was up, it pretty much expanded quite rapidly. People realized that, wow, we can share this information instantaneously, no post office, no nothing. So, yeah.
And that was, they put their bibliographical database onto a Tymshare host?
Tymshare host, and, no, they didn't. They kept their own host. We just provided the network for NIH.
And
Some of these deals were sort of half and half. Some of them were just like NIH, where it's all theirs. Some of them were, we held the information. It just, once it got going, it was very flexible.
well, I can imagine you can either kind of provide an infrastructure service, a kind of compute service, or any combination
Any
thereof.
combination, and it can evolve as you figure out what you're doing, and right. It was very flexible, and we had very good salesmen, and they could, whatever the customer needed, we could come up with.
And for NIH, for example, for this kind of health information data, would it be that NIH was paying you when people connected to it for free? Is that kind of what would happen? Like I'm at a medical school and I want to connect to it.
We
they would pay
we
for the
charged
traffic?
NIH, and most and I think most of their clients were theirs, and
Right.
and just used, and we charged for the service overall, NIH, right? We didn't charge each little.
Each
little-
person
no.
trying to look at it.
No.
I see.
But we knew we knew which ones were logging into NIH, so we could keep track of their time.
Hmm.
$10. No, we didn't charge.
Yeah.
We're past the $10 an hour. by the way.
Well, let's see.
How much were you charging?
I don't remember what we were charging for at that point. I just had to deal with that $10 an hour, and with the queues and everything. So I really remember
Yeah.
that.
Could I ask something else?
Please do.
I was wondering about your trajectory from being just the engineer on the monitor up the management chain up to vice president. How did that go? Like the stages of becoming more and more responsibility.
Well, it just sort of one by one. I started out getting the accounting projects, and the monitor kind of on the side because it was pretty stable, and then there'd be another project that they needed a little bit of this, or some salesman would come in with some opportunity that didn't exactly fit the regular marketplace, so that would. Ron Braniff ran sales. He's really good, and it's a shame that he hasn't been willing yet to do an oral history, and I'm hoping, Mike and I are still hoping that we can get him to at least participate in a conversation, because he was really good at the market that Tymshare was in. But as these other little things came along, and particularly after Bernie Goldstein, not entirely, but particularly after Bernie got involved, Bernie was into acquisitions. He wanted to grow the value of the company. He wasn't interested in maintaining the traditional market, the traditional business. He wanted to grow the value of the company. He did a lot of acquisitions. And acquisitions came with unique ideas about how to do things. And so we had to integrate all those companies. They didn't fit in anybody else's division, and so they often came to mind, the ones that were totally off the wall. And so, like the airline reservation systems and some of the home banking systems, and like crazy. Nobody had ever thought of doing some of these things, and so they came to my division. So eventually, we'd done enough acquisitions that it ended up a good-sized division.
And that was the integrated systems division?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
So it had essentially evolved,
Just evolved.
by a process of accretion,
Yeah.
taking on more and more.
Taking
and
on
then
more and more,
yeah.
all the strange things that nobody else could figure out what to do with. Yeah, I got all those.
And,
Which was really fun, because it was the great background for living in today's world.
I'm sure. I'm sure.